Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a mini-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Episode 5, Misconceptions about Science. This episode is the final podcast in the introductory series where we've been focusing on defining what science is. We've talked about how it's done, how it organizes its ideas, and what tools are used to further understand the goals of science in understanding the relationships that govern physical systems. After this podcast, we're going to move into historical territory as we begin a multi-part series on the history of the atom. Before we move on to that topic, however, I wanted to spend this episode addressing a few of the misconceptions people commonly have about science. Note, this is not to be confused with what are usually called scientific misconceptions, which are incorrect ideas about the physical relationships that govern physical systems. Something like the idea, say, that net force on an object is directly related to how fast the object is moving and in what direction. This episode is going to be a podcast where I try to address some of the incorrect or limited ideas people have about how science is actually done. Now, much of what I say here is actually implied in some of the earlier podcasts, but I think it's useful that the misconceptions that I'm going to be discussing are brought out and talked about in much greater detail. For me, the biggest misconception about science is that it isn't creative in the way the arts are. When this misconception is examined, usually the holder will say something like, science has done some really cool things and has developed a lot of really great technologies, but mostly what it is just a memorization of a lot of facts. My students often say something like, it's not like you painted something or wrote a new song or poem. At the core of this misconception is the idea that science doesn't create anything new. This misconception is also found in thinking about mathematics. It stems from the fact that for most of us, our exposure to math and science happens in a classroom where we either read about already established relationships within systems and are usually forced to at least memorize them, regardless of whether we understand them or not, or we read about and occasionally repeat a few experiments or observations that were done to establish those relationships. To be honest, those things aren't really science anymore. It's probably better to think of them as established facts that are the products of earlier scientific work. While the facts might be interesting and fundamental to the deeper understanding of a system, the creative work to establish them has already been done, and all that's left is for the learner to appreciate the creative work that has gone into discovering them. To use our law of falling bodies example from an earlier podcast, there isn't really any mystery to this anymore. Students of physics can read about this idea in the first couple of chapters of almost any physics textbook. And as I mentioned back in that Setting Out podcast, since most physicists think that it's the relationship that's really important, there's often little discussion of how Galileo and his students arrived at the information, how they got that relationship, how they figured that out, how that idea came to them. The creative nature of the work can be more closely accessed in two ways. First, one can read a good account of the work and thinking that Galileo had to do to arrive at the relationship. Second, the student could reconstruct the experiments that were done, gather the data themselves, and see how said data would have led Galileo to reach his conclusions. While both of these are good activities, what they lack is that essential moment where the student has to have that spark of inspiration to see the relationship between the parts of the system without already knowing the result. Let's see if we can draw an analogy with a more traditional artistic process, something that folks more often think of as, oh gee, that's actually artistic and creative. Let's say you'd like to be a great artist, painter perhaps, or a great musician. You can't just sit down at a canvas or an instrument and expect to create new works of great brilliance or deep insight at the first go. To get to that point, there are, if you believe the recent research, at least 10,000 hours of work you have to put in before you're ready to do that. What do you spend that time actually doing? Well, there's a number of things. First, you have to master your craft. As a painter, you have to learn how to prepare a canvas. You got to learn the rules of perspective. You have to make sketches. You have to understand color and how to mix it. There are a lot of little pieces and parts there you have to get to master your craft. As a musician, you have to learn how to play your instrument by first practicing scales in order to teach your muscles the exact motions to make. Additionally, you'd likely have to gain some understanding of music theory. In both cases, while you are doing these things, you become familiar with the works of the past masters in your fields. Say in painting, the Rembrandts, the Monets, and the Picassos. In music, it might be the Beethovens, the Mozarts, and the Ellingtons. In examining the works of these artists and musicians, you begin to understand why they did what they did and why it was so important and aesthetically appealing. As you gained mastery, you'd likely graduate to reproducing their works, first as exact copies, and then with your own additions and modifications as you learn to improvise off of their creativity. In doing this, you'd begin to understand how their art sought to ask questions of those who interacted with it and suggested resolutions to those questions that were both pleasing and satisfying, and that moved the art form forward. Once you had done all of this, you'd be truly ready to participate in the creative work of your chosen medium of expression, even as you had already begun to do at each step along the way. Your contributions would build on and add to those who had preceded you. In doing this, you would create something new and never before heard or seen. What you will notice is that in order to participate in artistic work, there's a lot of preparation that has to happen. The same is true for science. Every scientist has to put in around 10,000 hours of work mastering the foundational information and understanding their subject. They have to master the experimental and theoretical techniques of their disciplines. They have to learn about the work of earlier scientists and learn both how that work led to the relationships that it did and why those relationships are important. Participate in the scholarly conversation within their discipline. By this time, they're ready to develop scientific hypotheses and ways to test these descriptions of how systems behave. This is where a scientist is very much like a painter or a musician. Before each of these inquirers, there's a blank canvas that must be filled with the questions and investigations of the researcher. Since no one has answered the specific question before, there is no specific guide. While an artist or a scientist may look back to those who have gone before for inspiration, it is their imagination that the answers have to spring forth from. If those answers are good ones in some sense, they will survive scrutiny and skepticism. If they are not, they will, hopefully at least, create a conversation that will point in the direction of a better and more fruitful answer. Thus, while the facts of a scientific discipline are absolutely vital, studying them is the same thing as going to an art museum or listening to a music collection. They show what can be done and may inspire fascination and a desire to become a master artist, but they are merely the results of a deeper creative process, not the creative process itself. Using an example from an earlier podcast, again, imagine in your mind you're working with a 500-piece puzzle. Let's say each time you're given a piece of the puzzle, you have to try to come up with an explanation of what the picture is. Now, if you do this in a way that sheds some insight onto the puzzle, you get to pick another puzzle piece. If your hypothesis is especially insightful, you get to look at the pieces picture side up before you make your pick. Now, if your hypothesis is just okay, not great, but not terrible, you get to pick a piece, but what you have to do is you have to look at the pieces turned over so that you can only see the shape. Now, if your hypothesis is not very good, that you haven't been very creative or very insightful, then what you have to do is sort of reach your hand into the bag and just pick out whatever puzzle piece you happen to grab. That's where the creative element of all of this can really come in. As you might imagine, there's a lot of creativity needed in trying to make good predictions as to what the puzzle is a picture of. The better you are at it, the faster you'll figure out the puzzle by getting to pick better puzzle pieces. In the same way, the process of hypothesis formation and testing in science is a really creative process, much like that done by any artist or musician who creates a work of art. Historically, it's not surprising that many exceptional scientists were also gifted artists, musicians, or writers. Examples include Da Vinci, Goethe, Descartes, Einstein, and a host of others. Creativity is creativity. You either have it or you don't, and the truth is, everybody has it. The rest is just hard work and hours of mastering the things that you need to be able to do and understand in order to harness that creativity in a way that provides scientific insight. Another misconception I find prevalent amongst my students is that science is omnipotent and can solve any problem. Another way of stating this misconception might be that any problem or issue can be addressed through the application of scientific methods of inquiry or the technologies that arise through their use. This misconception stems from a deeper misunderstanding of the role and nature of scientific inquiry. I once read somewhere that human beings actually have the present land capacity and technology to feed every single person on the planet at above subsistence level, and that, at least from the late 1950s until recently, we actually produced enough food to do that. Additionally, the technological hurdles of food storage and distribution have largely been solved. Thus, there is no scientific reason for there ever to be famine. A similar observation can be made regarding a number of diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and the like. While the diseases may not have been eradicated, the medicines and healthcare treatments needed to significantly reduce these illnesses are presently available to all humankind, at least in a theoretical sense. Of course, the evening news is filled with stories of starving peoples and epidemic outbreaks of disease. I would argue that these are no longer primarily scientific problems, but rather issues to be addressed by other forms of inquiry found in the realms of political science, which, by the way, only rarely uses scientific forms of inquiry, and other value-based disciplines. In fact, I might argue that a focus on a scientific solution might, in some of these cases, be harmful for a couple of reasons. First, it reinforces the tendency found in Western civilization towards scientism. Now, what is scientism? Simply, it is the idea that scientific inquiry is superior to all other forms of inquiry, or, when taken even further, the only valid or useful form of inquiry. It is a bad idea that says that science is the only worthwhile way of thinking about things, because it's simply untrue. At some point, it doesn't matter how well a biologist understands the genome of a particular strain of rice. Even if they are able to develop a plant that's more disease and drought resistant and thus gives higher yields, if the rice is forced to sit and rot in a warehouse as two rival warlords fight over who will hoard the resource in order to reward their followers and starve their enemies, all the science in the world isn't going to solve the problem. In fact, that's not the type of problem that scientific inquiry can really solve. Secondly, the attitude that science is sort of a cure for everything breeds laziness, if not fatalism. If the feeling is that there will always be another scientific/technological miracle, why should we take actions to address the underlying causes for a problem? An example of this could be that if you feel like one day a pharmaceutical company will develop a pill that will cause you to lose weight after you overeat, why would you ever worry about controlling your caloric intake? While this seems like a trivial example, consider the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. This phenomenon can be directly traced to the tendency to overprescribe antibiotics going back to the 1950s. For a long time, the medical community didn't worry about bacteria evolving immunity to existing antibiotics because of the idea that medical science would just develop another set of bacteria-killing drugs that will be just as effective as the ones that are being used now that the bacteria were developing resistance to. Unfortunately, many researchers now believe that we've kind of run out of ideas regarding new types of antibiotics and have yet to find another vein of investigation that will lead to something that the superbugs aren't resistant to. More importantly, however, even if such a solution were found by a brilliant mind discovering a new process to disrupt how bacteria work in the human body, it should be understood that due to the process of evolutionary adaptation, continued overuse of a new class of antibiotic would just lead to a new type of bacteria that were resistant to those solutions. And thus what we do is just merely delay the time when we were back to the state prior to 1900 and the invention of the first effective antibiotics. The better thing to do is to spend time and effort educating physicians on proper prescription guidelines and developing healthcare procedures that limit the spread of various types of bacteria. In closing on this misconception, what we have to acknowledge is that there will always be problems where science is either limited or ineffective in its usefulness. And thus it is vital that leaders within governments, industries, and even scientific communities learn to understand and use a wide variety of methods of inquiry. As an editorial aside, it's my belief that this breadth of understanding of different forms of inquiry is one of the greatest values that can be developed in a well-rounded liberal arts education. Another misconception is about what the purpose of science actually is. Now, to get this one right, I have to kind of use what I call my 50s black and white documentary announcer's voice, because that's actually, when I was a kid, where I found the misconception most prevalent. The misconception says something like, "Science is primarily concerned with the betterment of humankind." While this sounds great and noble and all, it's just not true. As I said in the first podcast, the fundamental purpose of science is to understand the universe well enough to deduce the basic relationships that govern it. This is especially true in the pure sciences. Scientists can't really know how their discoveries will be used or developed. The best they can do is to try and understand how a system works and trust that this knowledge will be used for the best purposes, however that may be defined. There are two good examples of this in the realm of atomic physics. The first is with the discovery of radioactivity by Ernest Rutherford and the Curies. They sought to understand the emission of particles and energy from matter that ought to have been stable. Their work directly led to many of the technologies of nuclear medicine that have saved millions of lives, even as it, unbeknownst to them, contributed to their deaths from cancer. On the other hand, their investigations and subsequent understanding of these phenomena was vital to the work of Enrico Fermi. Fermi was the first person to create a controlled nuclear fission reaction. He was trying to understand the relationships that governed the nucleus of the atom and knew that if what he had hypothesized was true, he could cause uranium atoms to fall apart at an accelerated but still controlled rate. His success in creating the controlled nuclear reaction meant that his mathematical models were an accurate enough description of the nuclei of the atoms that he could predict the outcome of a specific physical process that he had devised. The technologies derived from this understanding of the atom led to what many historians label as the atomic age, symbolized by both the atomic bomb and the atomic power plant. The political, economic, and sociological impacts of this work reverberate today in ways that Fermi couldn't have predicted that day in 1942 under the bleachers of the old football stadium at the University of Chicago. Physicist and Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, in a 1963 speech given as part of his John Dance lectures for the University of Washington, relates a Buddhist proverb. The proverb, translated into a context we in the West might better understand, goes something like, "To every man is given the key to the gates of heaven. The same key opens the gates of hell." So too, says Feynman, with science. Quoting from the lecture titled "The Uncertainty of Science," Feynman says, "In a way it," meaning science, is a key to the gates of heaven, and the same key opens the gates of hell. And we do not have any instructions as to which is which gate. Shall we throw away the key and never have a way to enter the gates of heaven? Or shall we struggle with the problem of which is the best way to use the key? That, of course, is a very serious question, but I think we cannot deny the value of the key to the gates of heaven. Feynman continues, all major problems of the relations between science and society lie in this same area. When the scientist is told that he must be more responsible for his effects on society, it is the applications of science that are referred to. If you work to develop nuclear energy, you must realize that it can be used harmfully. Therefore, you would expect that, in a discussion of this kind by a scientist, this would be the most important topic. I think to say that these are scientific problems is an exaggeration. They are far more humanitarian problems. The fact that how to work the power is clear, but how to control it is not, is something not so scientific and is not something a scientist knows so much about." Unquote. One of the criticisms that I've heard related to this misconception is that science spends too much time researching things that seem trivial or esoteric. While it is true that often the results of scientific research have little to do with what we think of as everyday concerns, it is impossible to determine ahead of time when a particular piece of scientific understanding or knowledge will unlock a whole new realm of technological innovation. While it may not seem to be very practical or helpful to have a team of biologists studying how a certain class of amphibians might keep from being eaten by a certain predator, who knows if the pheromone they exude from the skin might not help become the next type of insect repellent used in malaria-ridden parts of the world. This sort of thing actually happened in the years between 1895 and 1923, even 1932. Physicists in Europe were doing work to try to understand, first, the interaction of light and matter. Over the course of the next 30 or 40 years, they came up with a very esoteric and difficult to understand scientific theory known as quantum mechanics to describe not just how light and matter interacted, but that explained the true nature of matter itself and, in a sense, talked about how the universe was structured. At first, this theory had almost no practical application and was very much thought of as belonging to the realm of pure science. However, as the pure science was better understood, it began to be applied to more complex systems until, in around 1952, researchers at Bell Laboratories, using the ideas of quantum mechanics as they were applied to a class of substances known as semiconductors, developed both the first diode and, more importantly, the first transistor. Of course, the fact that you're listening to this podcast on some sort of transistor-based electronic device rather than one using vacuum tube technology tells you all you need to know about how this technology was developed and applied to change the world we live in today. Planck, Einstein, Bohr, Dirac, Pauli, Schrödinger, and Heisenberg, to name just a few, had no idea their investigations would lead to this point. Neither did the universities and governments who sponsored and paid for the research. Even Bell Labs, who was paying for the applied scientific work, was unaware of the vast potential that the line of research would unlock. As James Burke points out throughout his entire Connections series, it is nearly impossible to know where a series of investigations will lead in the future. These interactions are too complex and the human mind too creative to be able to say, at the pure science stage, what will lead to a beneficial societal outcome and what will remain in the realm of knowledge interesting only to the specialist in the field. It seems better to me to invest in a broad array of pure research and trust that out of that will come the building blocks of tomorrow's world, often from unexpected sources. Nowhere is this more true, I think, than in the field of applied mathematics, which is developing the tools that scientists will use to better understand and model the universe in ways we can't even begin to imagine now. Such tools will, as they did in the shift from classical to modern physics, allow us to fundamentally reconstruct our conceptions of the physical world in ways that will change everything. The final misconception I'd like to address in this episode has to do with scientists themselves. This is what I call the Mr. Spock fallacy. The idea, epitomized by the popular character from the 1960s TV show Star Trek and the more recent movies, is that scientists are somehow beings of pure reason and logic. Many people believe that most scientists are humanless robots who go into a lab and make cold and calculating decisions with little emotion or thought of what it might mean. I'm a scientist. I've known a lot of scientists, and I've read biographies of even more scientists. One of the first things that stands out about the people I know and have read about is how passionate and excited they are about what they do. To be honest, I got into astronomy and astrophysics not because I was particularly good at it, but because it was the thing that was so interesting and engaging to me that I couldn't imagine doing anything else. A person doesn't invest the time and energy into something like science if they aren't deeply invested in it both intellectually and emotionally. For me, the night sky is one of the most beautiful things I see. When I look at pictures of barred spiral galaxies, I don't just see them as a physical system to be described with a bunch of equations, though I do see them as that, but I also see them as truly elegant expressions of the symmetries deeply embedded in nature. They evoke in me an aesthetic response as well as an intellectual one. Like so many other scientists have expressed over the centuries, I find a great beauty in nature that is only enhanced by and through my scientific understanding. Looking at the heavens with an analytically trained mind adds to my appreciation of its beauty rather than detracting from it. This also, though, leads to a related discussion of objectivity and bias. There are those who believe that science only deals with facts and deductive truth, and that scientists are, therefore, always completely objective and rational. When a person who believes this finds that it is untrue, seriously, have you ever met a human being who is completely objective and rational? It creates a deep discomfort and a sense of betrayal. We scientists are human beings. Yes, we try to be objective and rational because we understand that this is what our method of inquiry requires, and being so leads to fewer mistakes. But we are fundamentally passionate and invested in what we are studying. This is why the method of inquiry is so important. It contains built-in checks on the excesses of exuberance. Sometimes, as a researcher, you get really attached to an idea. You really want it to be true for whatever reason. Perhaps it has a mathematical elegance that you find appealing. Maybe it agrees with and reinforces some basic worldview that you have. Regardless, when that happens, it's really, really hard to be completely objective. You're biased towards that particular idea. Historically, the story of Johannes Kepler, I think, is really very instructive here. Kepler was a mathematician and natural philosopher who believed in Copernicus's heliocentric model of the solar system back in a time when that was up for serious scholarly debate. One of the features of Copernicus's model was that the planets had to move in perfect circles because it was thought, going all the way back to Pythagoras, that the circle and the sphere were the most perfect shapes and thus were the best expression of the mind of God. Kepler wanted to use the observations of a man by the name of Tycho Brahe to show that this was true because he desperately wanted to see God's mind show up as expressed in the orbits of the planets. Unfortunately, Kepler couldn't get Tycho's observations to match his initial mathematical models based on this idea of a planet moving in a circle. Kepler had a bias here. He wanted circular orbits because of the elegance of the circle appealed to him, and they supported his belief in a God who would use such a figure in his creation. The problem was that the data didn't support the bias. To his credit, Kepler valued the observational data over the ideas of his mind, which was, by the way, a revolutionary idea of its own at the time. And thus he discarded the circles and moved on to other figures before finally discovering that the geometrical shape known as the ellipse best described the orbits of the planets around the sun. Now, what if Kepler had clung to his biases? This is where the very process of scientific inquiry would have become so important. Kepler in his writing even said that he was tempted to discard a few of Brahe's observations, patch up his model, and publish it and be done with the whole thing. If he had done this, would we have gone off down some incorrect rule, fooled by some scientist with an agenda? I don't think so. I'm pretty sure that if Kepler had done this, which he didn't, there would have been other natural philosophers who would have put his ideas and Brahe's observations to the test. They would have noticed that the observations that were made didn't match Kepler's models as well as he said they should have, and they would have published those results for others to check. In time, the work of Kepler would have been recognized as flawed, and another person would have come up with a better model that involved ellipses. Now, would this have taken more time? Sure. It might have added another 50 or even 100 years to the process of getting the answer correct, but eventually, if the process of inquiry is followed, that would have happened. We would have gotten at the right answer. Once the correct model for the orbits had been put forward, the scientific community would have skeptically subjected it to the scrutiny unnecessary until the vast majority had come to the conclusion that it was an accurate description of what was happening. Fortunately for us, Kepler admirably rejected his biases when the data called for him to do that. Even so, his ideas were subjected to great scrutiny before being fully embraced by most natural philosophers of the time. It should be noted, however, it is not necessary for there to be 100% agreement on a scientific idea for it to be held to be the most accurate or correct description of a system. Even today, there are those who claim to be scientists with formal scientific training who reject the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. Because the scientific community long ago came to the vast consensus that Kepler and Newton and Halley and others were correct, such viewpoints are not considered to be credible unless valid scientific evidence and data could be presented that would cause a reinterpretation of the presently used model. While this seems like a rather trivial example, just such a misrepresentation of science is taking place today in the field of climatology. At this point, 97% of those trained to do research in this area are in agreement that not only is climate change taking place here on Earth, but that this change is being accelerated by human activities that release increasingly large amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The only real scientific debate taking place now, even among most of the skeptics, is how much change will occur given the rate of release presently occurring. To place this perhaps in another context, think of it this way. If you asked 100 physicians if an activity that you wanted to do was good or bad for you, and 97 of them said that it was bad and produced data to support their point of view, and 3 said that it wasn't bad and presented data to support their point of view, would you still do that activity? If you were objective and free of bias, I would guess that you would either stop doing that thing or not begin in the first place. However, if your biases are such that they support you continuing the activity that is overwhelmingly thought to be detrimental, I would guess you, and to be fair I, would have a much harder time giving it up. Perhaps in this example we can see the issues confronting both individual scientists as they face their own biases and in considering scientific issues in a broader scientific context. So, enough discussion of topics found primarily in the philosophy of science. We'll return to many of these topics in later podcasts and re-examine them in greater detail, but it's time to look at the development of a scientific idea from a historical perspective in order to better understand how all of this works itself out in the real world. So for the next 3 or 4 months, we'll look at the development of atomic theory from the time of the ancient Greeks up through the development of quantum mechanics. As a final note, I'd like to say thanks to everybody who's taken the time to download the podcast and give consideration to my ideas. It really means a lot to me to know you guys are out there. If you'd like, go out to the podcast website, www.thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, and leave me a comment or 2 about what you'd like to see in the podcast. Or ask some questions and maybe we'll see if we can put together a question and answer podcast later on down the line. Also, if you'd like to leave a review at iTunes, I really would appreciate it. It's a great way for me to get the information out and to get the word out about what I'm doing here. So, until next time, full sails on your journey.